Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Red Bull find themselves under serious pressure after what Max Verstappen did back in Spain. Their Drivers' Championship ambitions with their lead man are arguably fading substantially. Horner doesn't necessarily see it that way, but their Constructors' ambitions have long been dead in the water. Nico Rosberg says if they were to give Isack Hadjar the call and say, hey, step up to the main team instead of Yuki Tsunoda, he should outright deny it, reject the opportunity and say there is no way that I'm doing that because it would be detrimental to my career. That is a pretty damning statement on the state of Red Bull right now. What do they need to do to fix it? Can they do anything at all? Very much to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. This picture is from Montreal. That's because that's where we're going this upcoming weekend. These are some images of Montreal effectively today because the air quality up in that part of Canada is not the best due to a lot of wildfires. And this time of year, it seems that that's a problem. Now, last year, I mean, plenty of years to be fair, the weather in Montreal is always a question mark for the Grand Prix. We've had hail last year that nearly cancelled FP1, FP2. I think that was what people attending the track were told was happening, but that was not the case. It went ahead as scheduled, but, you know, there was massive hailstorm. Of course, that famous Grand Prix in 2011, right, when Button won, and it was like 4 hours long. There was all the rain and everything that happened that time. We see this in Montreal relatively frequently, and maybe we could again have some weather-related issues occurring for this weekend. Of course, as it stands, it's expected to go ahead as planned, nothing doing here, and after wildfire concerns, you know, it's been put to bed. But of course, today is Sunday, the race is on next Sunday, so there's a long time potentially. So the weather is meant to be pretty hot. I'm not exactly sure what the forecast is saying. Of course, it can very swiftly change, but the point is that we have seen plenty of adverse weather conditions affect things in Montreal over the years. It may be a similar story this time around as well. There was a bit of drama too on the Grand Prix tracks in general. Montreal is kind of like a hybrid circuit, really. It's kind of a street track, technically, because of the way that it's laid out. But it's not really, it doesn't feel that way necessarily. It's definitely a good circuit that you could design elsewhere as well. I think Montreal's one of the, you know, better circuits, at least a solid middle of the pack circuit we have on the calendar. Probably not one of the absolute best, but not down there with the worst. Now we know that the Madring, whatever, is not expected to be especially spectacular. Carlos Sainz has been hitting the streets of Madrid this weekend ahead of the race at the Madring. So, you know, there's so much hype around this Grand Prix. For Barcelona, Catalonia lovers like myself, I'm not very happy with this, although the current plan is that they will both share the calendar next year. We'll get both Barcelona and Madrid on next year's calendar, after which point we will only have Madrid for the next decade. But there were some rumours that maybe the track won't be ready in time, and if that's true, then Barcelona could stay a little bit longer anyway, but we'll see if that actually happens. I think Hamilton was kind of on point when he said 90% of, effectively the newer circuits are 90% worse than the older circuits, right? And I think that, you know, people in Hamilton's position, who have obviously been around a rather long time, you know, they're going to make comments such as this, and they wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Lots of the maybe younger, more current drivers don't really maybe want to say what they truly think on certain topics, especially, you know, Alonso and, you know, Sainz. They're not going to be too negative about the change of the Spanish Grand Prix to the new circuit because, you know, those guys want them on board to give it the big up, but we're not necessarily going to do that too in the F1 community if we think that X track is worse than Y track, as many of the drivers believe. There was also lots of talk, especially on the Mercedes side. Yeah, there's problems at Red Bull, plenty of problems at Ferrari. McLaren seem relatively clean at the moment, but who knows what's lurking around the corner. No dominance ever lasts forever, as you know, we found out over the last several months. But Mercedes, they've had a couple of engine failures, not just in their own Antonelli car back in Spain, but also the weekend before for Fernando Alonso in, of course, Monaco. There are questions on why this happens. Right now, Mercedes don't really know. They know they had a catastrophic engine failure, destroyed the engine, and that engine is totally unrecoverable. But they're investigating it at Brixworth, trying to figure out what went wrong, and the findings could be relevant for other teams as well if it's similar to what happened to Alonso back in Monaco. The point, I guess, is that Piastri has now finished 37 races in a row or something. Like, he's on a really impressive streak of individual performance, but also of reliability of the car. We've not really, I mean, even Russell over the last couple of years has had his issues. Last year, Silverstone, right? Like, that Mercedes reliability that used to be absolutely bulletproof has not quite been the same, I would say, in the last 24 months to what it was before. I mean, Hamilton, was it 2022? He had the engine failure, whatever it was, at Abu Dhabi. Like, you know, we've seen it plenty of times really over this ground effect era. It's not like it doesn't happen to other teams, of course it does. But in terms of consistency of the engines, I mean, 2022 was obviously a bad year for Ferrari and for Red Bull with some of the gearbox issues and the drive issues they had at the start of the season. But 2023, 24, 25, I wouldn't say the Mercedes engine has been any more reliable, their powertrain, than we've seen from the alternatives. So it's an interesting question that they've got to figure out. I think many will be wondering, well, is this going to affect McLaren as well? Like, are they in a potentially vulnerable position? Now, the answer is we don't really know. And, you know, Kimi's DNF in Barcelona was due to a loss of oil pressure, potentially electrical, failed loom or pressure sensor, falsely report a pressure loss, triggering protections even if the pressure is fine, the car thinks it isn't, etc., etc. So anyway, Molly's an expert on this type of stuff. She goes through what she thinks on it and, you know, potentially what they could do to fix it. The bottom line is it was an MG UK issue for Alonso in Monaco, potentially something mechanical as well because the MG UK fails, the IC has to compensate, etc., etc. And there are a few other pieces. I think the question people wanted answered is that, okay, why not McLaren, right? If we've got Mercedes suffering from this, if we've got, of course, Aston Martin suffering from this, Williams has been pretty okay in recent times. You know, McLaren are looking pretty good. The point, I suppose, is that the engine is going to have different packaging, and the implication is that potentially McLaren have done a better job packaging Mercedes engine than even Mercedes themselves have, which would be pretty impressive, but obviously it all forms the part of the same car, I suppose. Let's talk driver market. Perez. This is the latest update, and frankly, this is the domino that kind of needs to fall. We understand that contract talks have been held with both Cadillac and Alpine over recent weeks. We don't know where he's going to go. As I said the other day, if Alpine are serious and they want him and they'll give him decent money, it's kind of tough to turn that opportunity down. Enstone have a reputation for building at least solid chassis, and the Mercedes might have the best engine next year. Okay, Cadillac, who knows? The thing is with Cadillac, you're going to get Ferrari power, you're going to get the Cadillac brand and, you know, energy and for the Americas, and I totally get that. But, you know, how much confidence do we have of Cadillac building a great chassis for 2026? Not much. And the Ferrari engine is a big question mark as well, whereas the Mercedes engine is much less of a question mark. It's almost certain, I would say, to be at least one of the best two engines on the grid. We don't really know, you know, where Honda, let's say, or Red Bull are going to find themselves either. But for Cadillac, there's potentially more risk. So if Alpine are interested, I think Perez would be, be difficult to turn that down if Briatore says, look, Colapinto's not really doing great, we'll bring you in instead and keep the whole South American money rolling in. Maybe that's a strategy there. So I think Perez's decision, or what the teams decide, because maybe the offer from Cadillac might be far better, and maybe Perez has certain requirements that he doesn't want to, wants to deliver somewhere, not somewhere else. Who knows? But the point is, as I've said before, I think Perez is getting on the grid next year. It's probably one of these two teams. Depends how things go in coming weeks where that turns out to be. Carlos Sainz was actually still talking about getting overlooked by Red Bull, overlooked by Mercedes, although to be fair for Mercedes, it seemed to be more of a case of they wanted him maybe on a 1 year, he wanted more of a 2 year, and they were like, we'll put Antonelli in, and was that a mistake? Not really, as it's turned out so far this season, at least in terms of preparing Antonelli for what is likely to be a very promising future indeed. Williams, he talks about repaying their trust, says it's been a blessing so far, but of course he will be somewhat frustrated that he's like 30 points behind Alex Albon when he certainly didn't expect to be. But look, people talk about Hamilton's adaptation to Ferrari. Yeah, that's a big talking point, it's a big challenge, but equally all the drivers that have moved and gone somewhere else, Sainz especially, have all kind of struggled. It's just they've not been as high profile as the Hamilton stuff. Let's talk Max though. He won the championship last year. He's won plenty of championships in a row. This year, it feels like too much of a tall order. As I've said before, never going to count Max out of these discussions. All it takes is, one upgrade for Red Bull that works, one switch and understanding that works. Maybe Barcelona was just great again because we have the highest tyre compounds, which tend to favour the teams that can control the core temperatures. That's where McLaren are strong. On weekends where we have the softer compounds again, such as in Montreal, maybe it's a very different story again. Max can start winning races. All it's going to take is the McLaren to take each other out and a couple of reliability things, and Max is right back in the hunt. Certainly not the favourite for the championship, but I'm not going to completely rule him out just yet. But 49 points back is a lot when it could have been far fewer than that had what happened at the end of Spain not happened. But Callum Nicholas, you guys might know, of course, long-time mechanic, probably the most notable on the Red Bull stable and frankly in Formula 1, said, interesting comment, don't really agree or believe it, but look, Callum Nicholas knows Max better than I do. I think Max is going to win the title this year and then call it a day. So in my opinion, both of those are wrong. I don't think he's winning the title this year, but I don't think he's calling it a day regardless, personally. But again, Callum Nicholas knows Max, he's worked with him for many years. So, maybe there's some idea to this. What do you guys think about that? Max calling it a day? There has been a rumour, to be fair, that Max could call it a day for a year and then return, take a sabbatical, then come back in 2027 when it's clear what the competitive picture looks like in F1. That I wouldn't totally rule out. The idea of Max just retiring after this season, never coming back, I think that's very doubtful. Obviously, he's got his frustrations with Red Bull and with the FIA and with other things, but effectively any team would take him, right? Is he going to turn down the opportunity to go and drive a Mercedes or whatever in the new regulations? Kind of unlikely, I would say. But yeah, intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below on that. But as I say, I don't think it's likely that he wins the title this year. The arguments might be, such as, let's say Hamilton had won the title in 2021. Would he have just retired? I mean, I don't know, but, possibly, probably. I think it's more likely that he would have done. He decided to come back in the end, of course, and, the merits of that decision, you can debate them, but I think Hamilton's, given a good account of himself over the last few years in general. The Ferrari stint so far this year has obviously been a serious challenge, but, usually if you're going to retire, you want to go out on a high. So if Max loses this year, he's not going to want to go out like that, is he? That's my thought. Intrigued to your perspective in the comments. The other big drama, though, at Red Bull is around just their setup in general, because we're talking about Max trying to win the championship. We're not talking about his teammate, whereas we are at the McLaren piece, obviously, and it's a different story at that team. We've seen how it goes with Max. Unbelievable driver, but whoever's in the car next to him struggles a lot. And it seems to be at least something to do with his preference for, as Alex Albon called it, turning the sensitivity up to the absolute maximum. Max drives a car that is very challenging to drive for anybody that isn't Max. And naturally, over the last few years, Red Bull have developed a car in a way that is very snappy on turn-in, has a bit of a loose rear end, but a car that Max can control and fundamentally is quicker than the alternative. The problem is that nobody else could deal with it, but also because Max is the guy, he's the man that they've listened to in all of their development trajectory. And over the last several years where Max has been at that team, they now effectively are a team that only, it's a one-car team, right? And Red Bull's been that way for a little bit of time. We've occasionally seen a solid Perez result over the last couple of seasons. Certainly the start of 2023 was actually very impressive in hindsight for Perez, but that was when the car was a bit more understeery. As soon as they started to dial it into Max's preferences, and, make the car faster, fundamentally, but also dive into what Max preferred, Perez fell off, lost confidence, crashes, spins in the wall, no pace. It's a very familiar story. Happens for Perez, happened for Lawson over the couple of Grand Prix. I mean, the engineers apparently were telling the team, Lawson's confidence is so shot, there's literally no point keeping him. And they didn't. They put Yuki in. Yuki initially was better. I think even in general probably has been slightly better. Marko says it's serious. The Yuki is often only 1/10 of a second behind in practice, but when it comes to quali, the gap opens up. The pressure's there. It's more difficult under pressure. Certainly with a car that you're not super comfortable with, it's challenging to drive. You might be 1/10 of a second off in practice when you're feeling pretty confident. You're not pushing 99.99% as you are in qualifying. Whereas in, the qualifying session, then all of a sudden the pressure's there. You better not crash. The car's a little bit challenging. It's all on the line. Then you maybe take it a little bit too cautiously, especially if you've had a crash the previous weekend or whatever, and then the gap is more like 5/6, and 5/6 today is not P1, P2, or P1, P4. That's, P2, P20 potentially, as we saw the last weekend. So it's obviously a problem, but I think fundamentally we've got to recognise that the issue here lies with Red Bull Racing, right? This is a Red Bull phenomenon. And yes, you might not rate Perez very highly. You might not rate Lawson very highly. You might not rate Tsunoda very highly. Of course, it was Gasly, it was Albon, but, they're better drivers today than they were back then. look, it's not like Red Bull have ever put a guy in that car since Ricciardo who's on that type of level. So that might be part of it. I think the idea is that great drivers can drive one of these Max Red Bulls, but good drivers just can't. And that's probably part of Red Bull's issue as well. They don't want to put, let's say a Carlos Sainz or something back in the car. That could be problematic. But I think there's clearly more to it than that. Like, it's not about the drivers, and this has been Max's point now for a long time. Like, he was actually quite defensive of Perez on this point to say, look, it's not really Checo's fault why he's struggling right now. There's more to it than that. We've seen it with Lawson, we've seen it with Tsunoda, and Max is still saying the same thing. He's like, look, yeah, I know I'm the best, but the team has not designed a great machine that both drivers can actually drive. So that's when we get to this argument here from Nico Rosberg, and this is a very damning argument, really. I mean, and I don't disagree, fundamentally. Rosberg says, if I was Hadjar now, if ever the team starts to mention a promotion to Red Bull, I would literally decline. Because Hadjar's in a great spot. He's enjoying his time at Racing Bulls. He's driving a car which seems to be relatively benign. He can, handle it well. He can deliver great results in it pretty much every single week. Even when he has his little emotional moments, he's still able to lock in and deliver good performances. But of course, Red Bull are thinking about it, right? They're thinking, damn, Yuki was good, but, Hadjar maybe has more potential on what we've seen so far than Tsunoda has seen it for a couple of years. Maybe stick him in the Red Bull. Look, I think Red Bull have basically decided, and I think they were wise to, unless things go so badly for Yuki, that they will stick with him until the end of the season anyway. I don't think you're putting Hadjar in immediately. Because if Hadjar, genuinely, if Hadjar gets the call right now and say, Yuki was P20, we're putting you in, I mean, what are you meant to say in that spot? Can you decline it? I mean, I honestly think if you're Hadjar right now, you probably can, because your stock is pretty good. If you're Lawson and you're told, all right, you're going back in the Red Bull, you're not going to... Lawson isn't going to be able to do anything about it. He's going to have to do it, right? Like, he would have to do it. Whereas Hadjar actually, I think, carries some degree of weight. Whereas if he was asked that question, then Hadjar would, he wouldn't say, what are you talking about? Piss off, right? Like, he would say more something like, look, appreciate the offer, but I think it would be better for me to do this. And then we could have a conversation about it. And I think it probably would be, to be fair. Because I think that Lawson was in the car after not many Grand Prix. Even Max Verstappen didn't have many Grand Prix, but most Red Bull drivers had at least 20, 25 Grand Prix, if not way more than that, before they got the drive at Red Bull. I think this is a situation where for Hadjar, you don't want to give him 10 Grand Prix and throw him in the Red Bull, right? It's just a recipe for disaster. But I think as Rosberg kind of implies, this is much more indicative of a wider issue at Red Bull Racing than they have wanted to admit for some time. But I think now they are finally getting round to that realization, especially because Max's continuation in the sport is far from a guarantee. Callum Nicholas made his point. He thinks Max is going to quit at the end of the season. Who knows whether that's true? But even if he doesn't quit the sport, but he quits Red Bull next year, goes to a different team, Mercedes, Aston Martin, wherever, what does it leave Red Bull, right? Like, they've got this car, they've got this way of designing a car that, they can't seem to find a driver other than Max that can actually drive. Maybe in that hypothetical, you go and sign Russell and he can cope with it, but it's still probably not exactly what he would want. So, yeah, pretty fascinating. The conclusion seems to be Yuki's going to get the drive at least until the end of the season. After that, who really knows? So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.